All right, good afternoon, Dad. Today
Good
is
morning.
Monday. Today's Monday, August 4th. And let's start with this nuclear sub stuff. So Trump responded
Oh,
to Medvedev and said, okay, I'm sending some Ohio-class nuclear submarines. Is this a big deal? I mean, I've been hearing different things. Some
yeah.
people say this is nothing. These subs are always out there doing
Yeah.
their thing. And other people think that this is a
Right.
major
My
escalation.
understanding is, yeah, right. They're always supposed to be out there and they're always supposed to be positioned where they could be used in case of some crisis. They could, you know, the point is deterrence. So they need to be positioned where they can, wreak devastation on the enemy. In this case, it would be Russia from the American perspective. Now, it's possible that they could be deployed even closer to Russia, but it's not clear that they need to be. It's a lot of people who know about this. I don't have any particular knowledge about it, but say that it's just a bunch of BS and that Trump doesn't know what he's talking about. Some say, well, some minor adjustments could be made, but it's nothing really major. There wouldn't be a change in the, let's say, strategic posture of our nuclear forces. It would, but just the fact that he said this is quite extraordinary, and it seems to suggest somebody who is maybe not very stable and doesn't really have a very clear understanding of the balance of nuclear forces and our use of deterrence. And it's hard to understand what it was. Medvedev is a kind of a gadfly. He's a troll. He's always kind of purposely needling the other side. But he didn't say anything. He didn't threaten nuclear war against the U.S. In fact, what he was saying, he was sort of a joke, a pun about, Trump had mentioned the dead economies of India and Russia, and he spoke about, the dead hand of the Russian nuclear deterrence. And that is this, we're not even sure that they still had it, but it's certainly in the Soviet years. The idea of the dead hand was if the Soviet Union suffered a decapitation strike. America sent in these missiles and Moscow took out Moscow and the entire Kremlin. Even if there was nobody to issue the order, in that case, there would be an automatic response. The missiles would fly back. That's the dead hand. But that of course, means that the Americans would have to attack first. So he's talking about retaliation to, an American strike. He's not threatening, a strike by Russia, a first strike, by any means. So it's hard to understand why Trump responded in the way he did. And it is somewhat worrying. I don't think it really changes anything between the nuclear forces of the two sides right now. But it just suggests, again, somebody who's maybe a little bit unstable, easily provoked. And that is worrying in the case of, when you're talking about nuclear war.
Right, it's a bad look for Trump as well. It's just he's the biggest troll. He's always dishing it, He's
Right.
always making threats,
Right.
but he can't take it. This wasn't even a threat. This was a reminder of how dangerous of a game we're playing. And his response was just to
Right.
escalate, to say that, okay, yeah, this is a dangerous game. Let's play it, is almost like what he's saying. He's very nonchalant about it. Like, okay, well, we'll send some nuclear subs. So what you're saying is that you're making a threat that, we're ready to go nuclear. And he even said that, right? He said, yeah, we're ready to go nuclear, right? I mean, this is this is the scary thing, is just that he is very nonchalant about this. It almost feels like his administration now has adopted the framework that we are at war with Russia via Ukraine, and that they're not going to back down no matter what. And they understand that if they lose, then the U.S. world order is over. And Trump has thrown his hat in that ring with the Lindsey Grahams, the neocons, that's their worldview. And that this is an existential crisis, not just for Russia. We've made it existential somehow for ourselves. Because if we lose in Ukraine, then, our primacy is done. And if that's the case, that's scary. And that's why he's saying, like, yeah, we're ready for nuclear war. We're going all the way on this thing. Do you think that's true, that that is the framework that this administration is now
Well,
adopting it, and
yeah.
that's how we should look at it?
Yeah, I don't think they're adopting any new framework. Again, it's just Trump. Trump is not a strategic thinker. He's not expressing any new doctrine. Nothing of the sort. I mean, Trump is Trump, and you just don't know what he's going to say from 5 minutes to the next. From 1 minute to the next is what I should say. So I doubt that this is something that he discussed with anybody. I doubt this is the result of any discussion that he had with any of his advisors. He just tweeted it. And on the one hand, I don't think we should say, okay, now there is a new policy. On the other hand, I do find it worrying, again, for the reasons that I gave. It's just a reflection that this is somebody who's very unpredictable, easily provoked. Again, he was subject to a certain amount of needling, but as you say, it's something that he does all the time. You think that there should be give and take, and then all of a sudden he took it into the real world, and not just, again, we're not just talking about conventional weapons, but nuclear weapons. Even if this what he did, maybe actually it changed nothing. Perhaps those submarines were exactly where they were supposed to be, or as close to the Russian coast as they possibly could be. Nothing changed. Or if it did, it was, maybe they moved another 10 miles or something underwater, as something like that. So, we're not talking a big change, but just the fact that he brought it into the real world and into the real world of nuclear deterrence and mutually assured destruction, that I find just worrying. I don't know what it means, but other than, okay, we have somebody who has, who has the nuclear codes, who has the authority to actually launch a nuclear strike that is provoked by a tweet, and feels like that, he needs to respond in a way, take us, even if we're talking about just one tiny step closer to a nuclear conflict, anything closer is very worrying, and especially in response to something so minor. So you have to worry down the road. Okay, I don't think that he's even thought the whole thing through. He just doesn't seem to really think things through. All this talk about him being the 5D chess player or whatever is just nonsense. He's never been that way. But somewhere down the road, again, when the Russians are marching on Kiev or crossing the Dnieper, there are many different scenarios that we've described, and that may very well, certainly at least some of them are going to take place in the future, and probably the not so distant future. When that happens, how is he going to respond? If a tweet pushed him to do this, what might he do in that situation? We haven't thought about Trump going nuclear, but I guess we're forced to at least think about the possibility that he might threaten some sort of nuclear response. I don't think so, but you have to worry about it, right?
Yeah, well, he's just so unpredictable. I mean, sure, okay, you said Trump maybe doesn't have a framework that, I was saying that this is just their current framework the administration is looking at, but he has no framework at all, right?
Right.
He just whatever, he's just a stream of consciousness. So, but this current iteration of Trump that we're seeing,
right,
feels like that this is the current framework that he's the lens that he's looking at this conflict at now, is he's getting pulled in to thinking that, no, we are at war with Russia now and via Ukraine, and we're not going to lose. And that's why, he's making these threats. He's hanging out with Lindsey Graham, and Lindsey Graham just rubbing his hands and saying, we're showing it, using words like, we'll whoop Putin's ass, things like this, and saying we're ready to go nuclear, and then shortening this deadline to 10 days. I feel like he's painting himself in a corner, though, with this. Like, even if he wants to get out, like, what he is this type of... I feel like we're at a worse position now than we were with Biden, and that's crazy to think. But do you feel the same way? Do you think you feel safer now?
Yeah.
Or
well, yeah, I would go back to, again, what the Russians said all along, and actually, again, more evidence came out, with the recent document dumps about Russiagate back in the, his first term. Again, one of the findings was that in fact Putin, did favor Hillary Clinton just because she was predictable. This is something that he said himself, but this was also reports that were coming to our intelligence agencies, but those were suppressed in the CIA, or ICA, the Intelligence Community Assessment, because they were counter to what Brennan at that time wanted to present. But yeah, I think it's what Putin has said on more than one occasion, that he actually preferred the Democrats because he knew what he was dealing with. And in the case of Trump, he didn't really know that Trump was unpredictable. And predictability, is very important. Even if it's if it's the kind of grim predictability that you get from the Democrats, it's still, when you're dealing with questions of nuclear war, you prefer to have that. You know where you are. But with Trump, I think this is a perfect example of what happened. You don't know what you're dealing with. And it is a very, very, difficult situation. You don't know exactly what is going to trigger him. Because, again, this was such a minor incident. It's just not, okay, there was this tweet by Medvedev. But there's also, recently Trump has, after talking about Putin in rather friendly terms and respectful terms, he's been criticizing him very harshly, and using, describing him in very unflattering terms ever since that one phone call. And it's just something, okay, well, what was it that Putin said? But it's just like, Putin's probably, wondering himself, he's just like, well, what the heck? What is it that's going to trigger this guy? This is a little bit dangerous. If he's just some sort of, somebody you have to deal with at work or whatever, that's an annoyance. But here he is, the head of arguably the most powerful country in the world, and we don't know what's going to set him off.
Right. Do you feel that Trump has painted himself into an escalation corner where, the only way he can get out now is to escalate because of this 10-day, warning that he gave, which is going to be up in just by the end of this week.
Yeah.
And, and these tweets, the language that he's using.
It's Friday, yeah.
Right. So, has he painted himself into that escalation corner, and has he sent Witkoff over to Moscow?
Yeah, no, it's very worrying.
Try to get him out?
It is. I don't know. Again, he sometimes shows himself he's a master of.
Can you hear me, Dad? He's a master of what? I can see you.
Yeah. I don't know why he sent Witkoff. Maybe it is. Again, I guess Witkoff is supposed to arrive here in Moscow in 2 or 3 days, so Wednesday or Thursday, right before the deadline. So maybe the idea is to, hello, I can hear you. Can you hear me? Okay, yeah, right, there have been some interruptions. So occasionally I can't hear you, but I can hear you fine right now. I was just saying that Witkoff is supposed to arrive here Wednesday or Thursday, right before the deadline. And so that suggests that maybe, he's going to just, he's just adding to the pressure, say, this is it, this is your final chance. But we don't know. We don't really know what's going on. And the Russians may not know either what's going on. Who knows? Maybe Witkoff still doesn't know what's going on. But in any case, he's supposed to be here soon. And then, okay, the deadline's come, and we've talked about how it's not going to be possible for Trump to make good on his threats. And it seems like everybody understands that, except, maybe Trump himself. But maybe, so what is he going to do? Yeah, there's always a possibility that he'll just pretend that it was a great success and move on. And he's done that with all kinds of things. He's declared that he'll just say that the Russians caved in and promised him something or whatever, and it'll be a bunch of nonsense. But it wouldn't be the first time that he's done such a thing. But then there's also the chance that he may feel sort of humiliated and powerless and will want to lash out in some way. And we've seen, like in the case again of the Middle East, it seemed like that's the option that he took. So again, It's like Putin says, okay, the guy's unpredictable. He's unpredictable, so I'm not going to make a prediction about him. But it is a worrying situation. He may just walk away from it, proclaim victory, and then move on to something else. Let's just hope for that. But it doesn't. But yeah, I think there are a lot of reasons to be concerned. He seems to be, in general, to be in a foul mood. He's slapping tariffs on people left and right. Even harmless countries like Switzerland, they got hit with 39% tariffs. It was just a total shock to them. But apparently Trump was really angry. It was a result of a phone call where, the president of Switzerland could not persuade him to climb down. He wouldn't. He just said, "You've got too big a surplus, and that's that. We need to punish you." What can he do? I mean, it just.
Yeah, well, I mean, if everybody was calling me a pedophile, I'd probably be in a pretty foul mood too. So, I mean, it's a very dangerous situation where Trump is. I think you're right. He is just in this bad mood, and it can go any which way. What has Russia's response been to, the nuclear sub tweet and, just the rhetoric in general coming from Trump?
Well, I think in general, they're just trying to, well, in all cases, both the nuclear sub tweet and a lot of his other tweets, it seems they're always trying to kind of lower the temperature. They're not responding with angry tweets of their own, or like I think Medvedev, just ignored the Trump's nuclear subtweet. To my knowledge, he didn't really respond to that. And then Peskov, the spokesman, is just tends to say something, vague, and we're not seeing angry responses or threats of retaliation or any kind of threats from the Russians. They're trying to just, I think, just hope that the guy will calm down. That seems to be the all they can do at this point.
Yeah, I mean, I just feel like the political elite, and now this is including Trump now, unfortunately, have just sort of decided that war with Russia is inevitable. And in a sense, we already are at war with Russia. There is this open talk about we got to be ready by 2027. Once again, just broadcasting our plans. Okay, Russia, just stop, ceasefire, give us 2 years, and we'll come and kick your ass. It almost seems like what the
right. Well,
the
of course they
is.
don't put it that way.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, yeah, of course they always say is that Russia will try to invade us and like invade the Baltics or invade Poland. I'm just saying that, the way they frame it is that they're prepared for a Russian attack and a Russian invasion that will take place in 2 to 5 years. That's how it's. But Russia has, no intention of doing that. I think it's fair to say, there's just the chance of that is zero. So why are they saying this? And yeah, it is worrying. It's just that sometimes you talk about war so often that you can just make it into reality. People come to expect it, and then that first step becomes much easier. It's just that people have already, just as a result of your constant repetition, of insistence on the inevitability of war, people come to accept it, and then war does become an inevitability. I don't know.
Right.
Again, we've talked about this before. The thing, though, is that the Europeans, they're really all bark and no bite. They just don't have the capacity to wage war. So I don't know really what they're up to.
Right. But I am coming to the conclusion, and I think many other people are as well, that our political elite, are at war with Russia. And we have to understand that's the goal. And then all they're doing now is they're going to do whatever they can to manufacture consent for this war. Because it's in the plan. It's written into the plan. We have a date, 2027. It just seems like that's what's happening. And in any hope of a de-escalation just seems to be out the window now. I don't see any sign of it, of de-escalation. And I mean, I guess the only thing we should hope for is maybe a more rapid Russian victory to where they just have to say, okay, this is over. Or if Ukraine, so they dispose of Zelensky, and then you have just civil unrest in Ukraine, and then the whole thing is just chaos, and it's like, oh well, we can't do this proxy war anymore. It's just roaming bands of resistance fighters and banderites or whatever it is there, at the end. Is that probably
Hmm.
the way out? Like Ukraine collapse?
Yeah, well, I don't think there's any easy way out. Again, I'll just echo John Mearsheimer that Russia will win this war. That's inevitable, but it will be an ugly victory, meaning that it's going to be, yeah, they will take the territory that they need to take, uh, but there will be remain this festering wound, or if you want to say, use a different metaphor, smoldering ruins that could reignite, at any moment. In other words, yeah, this war may end, but the end, may not be permanent. It's just that if we have a Banderite Western Ukraine, for example, that simply is dedicated to the destruction of Russia, and then is supported by so many people in the West, even though it's a rump state, it's lost its most valuable land. It no longer has access to the sea. It can, as we've seen, it may just continue to conduct operations within Russia, terrorist operations. It continue to send drones, and Russia will be forced to to continue to advance, maybe all the way to the Polish border. That's not something they want to do, I'm sure. I think, like Mark Slota may be right. Most people's, well, I think there's no doubt that's not what the Russians want to do, but there are a couple of things that may force them to do it. And one is, first of all, the Europeans have threatened, like the moment there is some kind of ceasefire, to send their own troops there, the so-called, peacekeepers. Um, and that's something that Russia says is unacceptable. And so if it becomes clear to them that they just can't stop, because the moment they do stop at some point, these Western troops are going to be in Ukraine. Um, well, again, that is not something that they can countenance, and so to avoid that, they just may continue their advances. And then also just the fact that if you have this rabidly anti-Russian power, it's still there. It's still the anti-Russian. It's smaller, but it's still there, and it's going to continue to provoke Russia and to kill Russian citizens. Can they live with that? Maybe they'll choose to. But there will be pressure to continue and to finish the job, to go all the way to Poland. And that would be a mess for Russia, but they just may not have a choice. That maybe there just has to be. You can't have a partial victory. You have to have a total victory.
Okay, well, what's it looking like right now on the battlefield?
Well, around Pokrovsk in particular, it does look like there's going to, that things are moving pretty fast. The battle of Pokrovsk is really quite similar, I think it's fair to say, to Avdiivka. Similar in the way that it's played out. Again, we see these pinchers around the city. They're cutting off the lines of supply, and then a sudden penetration into the city. It's similar also in just the importance of these two cities. They're both important hubs. And after Avdiivka fall, there was a rather rapid Russian advance because there was just a lot of undefendable territory to the west of Avdiivka, and I think we'll see the same thing with Pokrovsk. So once Pokrovsk falls, there is going to be a rapid Russian advance. Now, the difference is that it's actually moving even faster. It's just like, especially in the last month or so, last couple of weeks, it looks like Pokrovsk will fall even faster than Avdiivka fell. At least that's the way it looks like right now. I mean, they are really they really are closing I think pretty much have encircled it. Maybe not physically encircled the city, but just operationally. They have imposed fire control over the remaining supply routes, and they are in the city. And they're penetrating it from different points. So I think it's going to be soon, and that it is important. Again, it's there's a lot more to Ukraine, including the Ukraine that Russia says it must take. There's the rest of Donetsk, and that'll be these cities to the north and to the east, Konstantinovka and Kramatorsk and Slavyansk. And then that'll be it pretty much for Donetsk. But then you have Zaporozhye, and that's, there's a big chunk of Zaporozhye that still is under Ukrainian control. Now the Russians are advancing from the south into, the part of Zaporozhye that's still under Ukrainian control. But there's a whole city of Zaporozhye, a very large city, much larger than Pokrovsk. And then there's Kherson, and Kherson is, again, they have committed themselves to taking it, and the big chunk of Kherson is on the other side of the Dnieper. And that's going to be very difficult. So there's still, even if we're not talking about these other oblasts, places like Nikolaev and Odessa and Kharkov, we're not even talking about that. We're just talking about the ones that the regions that Russia has committed to itself to. So even after the fall of Pokrovsk, there's still quite a bit to do. Now, it may be that we're looking at the beginning of the end, and there are some suggestions. We've kind of been expecting some sort of collapse, but I think we're seeing some things we've never seen before that suggest that those Ukrainian defenses are becoming very thin. The Russians, for the first time, sometimes they come upon actually some of these villages and there's really nobody there. It's just that the Ukrainians always, in the past, they would defend every village fiercely. They would have some people in there, dug in. And it looks like the Ukrainians just can't do that. They can't defend every single village. And so they're sometimes finding, just holes in the line. The Ukrainians aren't able to man the entire line. And, that's a sign, again, that they're running out of soldiers. And that's something that, of course, I think it's been clear the Ukrainians themselves have been saying, that is a real problem. And again, Western mainstream media is beginning to admit it. So at some point, they're just not going to have enough men to hold the line. Now, they still have enough so that they can put up resistance at certain points, at these critical points. And one example is up there in the Sumy region, just south of Kursk. If you remember, about a couple months ago, the Russians were advancing very rapidly there. And that just raised the alarm bell. So what among the Ukrainians, what they did is they sent some of their best forces up there, and they have pretty much stopped. Not entirely, but pretty much stopped the Russian advance. So that's what they're able to do. But the thing is, again, they don't have enough forces to cover the entire line. So, they did that. They stopped the advance in Sumy, but it's accelerating in other important places. And at some point, this game of that they're playing of transferring troops from one point on the line to another, it's going to become increasingly difficult. And at some point, it's just, the Russians are going to overwhelm them. And we're not even talking about all those Russians in the reserve. Again, it's hard to predict when these things will happen. I think we all expected it to happen months ago. But at some point it will. And there are signs that we're on the verge of it. So these advances, again, I've described this territory that the Russians need to take, and it's quite a considerable amount of territory, and some of it very challenging, involving a river crossing, for example. But if the Ukrainians are that much more weakened, it's something they can do, and it may happen faster, than we expect. At the current rate, we're talking about another couple of years, but it may just, who knows, it might be by the end of the year. It's these things, again, it really depends on what kind of resistance the Ukrainians are able to put up. Now, we know that they're struggling to send men to the line. We've all seen those videos, again, of the the men that are conscripted. And it turns out that, those aren't just, a little outlier. Some of the ones that we see tend to be the more violent or dramatic ones. But it was recently admitted in the Ukrainian media that it was the majority, the great majority, something on the order of 3/4 or higher of the men at the front line or been recently sent to the front line or did not go there willingly. They were forcibly conscripted, and maybe it wasn't they weren't dragged out of their cars or anything, but they were forcibly conscripted. They did not volunteer. And so you have a lot of people there who are just do not want to fight, and they're going to account for a greater and greater proportion of the, Ukrainian defenders. And again, you will fight, even if you do not want to be there, you put in a trench and you're given a gun and just to save your own life, you'll fire it, right? So there is something, but there is a limit to what those kind of forces can do. They're far less than ideal. And then there was a report that came out, I think today or yesterday, again from Ukrainian media, that there have been 400,000 desertions. Now, I think a certain percentage of those people have gone, actually, reappear. They deserted for a while, but we're still talking about huge numbers. I think, at least 100,000 permanent desertions.
Are there many defectors? Do you hear about that?
Well, okay, there aren't many. And there aren't many that have surrendered to the Russians. And the problem, as I understand it, is that it's a very dangerous thing to do. If you try to just, if you are found or, detected surrendering to the Russians, the Ukrainians will go out of their way to kill you. I mean, that's what happens. So there's only a fraction of those people that attempt to surrender are able to surrender, and a majority of them are actually killed or severely wounded by their own officers. I know in the past, I haven't read about it recently, but there are units, behind the lines that actually are enforcers. That's part of what they do. They keep people from deserting, but they also keep people from surrendering.
Or just retreating, right?
Yeah, well, yeah, when I say, yeah, right.
Desertion, I guess,
Yeah, exactly.
is to desert your post.
Yeah, that's what I meant, right, yeah. But you're right. Any kind of retreat, often they receive the orders not to retreat. That seems to be the general practice. And it seems to be the practice again in Pokrovsk. They should be retreating because they really don't have any chance of holding on to the city. And they could be, it looks like they're on the verge of being totally surrounded. There are still some ways for them to escape. But, those avenues of escape will be closed shortly.
I mean, isn't there a chance that if 75% of the men were forcefully conscripted, they don't want to be there, and now they all have guns, that they can turn those guns around on the people that forced them there?
I suppose there's a chance, Again, sometimes it just takes, well, so often with rebellions or revolutions, it's just that some incident, the first shot, and then everything can change. Right now we haven't seen any signs of that. There have been serious protests, in different Ukrainian cities about the forced conscription. It's something that's very, very unpopular, throughout Ukraine, including West Ukraine. But an armed rebellion, we haven't seen anything like that yet.
Right. Yeah, I was going to ask about Ukrainian society in general, because I've seen some of these protests as well in Western Ukraine. There was a large one. I just saw it on TV. I don't know how many people were out attacking TASS officers because they rounded up something like 1,500 men at once in some town, and I think the whole city town won out basically and said, give us our boys back.
Right.
So you have instances like this.
Right.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, right. I think in that case, you're right. I read about the same incident, and they had been, they were being held. These men that were forcibly conscripted were being held at a stadium, and it was like the citizens, their wives, their, relatives, friends, or whatever, were trying to get to the stadium to free them. And I think the authorities managed to get some buses there in time to get them out of the stadium. But it shows. I mean, that. It's not quite an armed rebellion, but we're getting close, right? There was some violence there.
Right. So we have this, and this is in Western Ukraine, Banderay
Right.
territory, areas
Right.
that are quite
Yeah.
nationalistic, hate Russians.
Right.
But still, you're having this situation. And then we've had the protests, some giant protests in Kiev against the anti-corruption agencies. So is Ukrainian society at a point of breaking and fracturing, and that can maybe end this war? Is that if it just, we are seeing signs of cracks right now in Ukraine's,
Right.
the
Right.
Kiev
I
regime's
would
grip
say,
on Ukraine?
yeah.
Sorry, yeah, go ahead.
Right. I think that that incident, that we just described, the men who were being held at the stadium, and the citizenry trying to free them. That I think is more significant than the protests that took place in Kiev. I think you could argue that those Kievan protests were really astroturfed. I mean, that this, as I think we discussed earlier, is just not so much a response to corruption. That may figure into it, but it was about Western control. Because again, there's so many things that have happened, and there has been so much corruption already. Um, but nobody went out into the streets until there was an effort by Zelensky and his guys to actually wrest control from this, the agencies that are directly controlled by the Western powers. And I think it's quite likely that those people out there were out there at the suggestion, or sometimes, were paid to be out there by Western NGOs. So that's, it's something. It shows, I think that is more indicative of some, the displeasure of Ukraine's Western masters. It's like, we don't care about all these other things you do. They certainly didn't care. They haven't cared about the forced conscriptions. That should be horrifying. And if, you're actually supposed to be representing some sort of more humane society, a more humane way of doing things, that's where the protest should be. But it was about control. I think that's really what it was about. And it was, that was Western spark. But when we're talking about the protests against the TCC, that is clearly, that is spontaneous, that is real, and it reflects a growing anger and frustration, that is boiling over in these kind of, these protests that we're seeing on a larger and larger scale. And that could lead to something.
Yeah, I'm wondering, are we able to kind of break down Ukrainian society into different factions now? We have the Zelensky Banderite ruling class right now that has the power, but then we also have the NGO class, those are the paid protesters, the people that came out that are basically on the payroll of the West. And then you have sort of the everyday citizenry who are not involved in either of these things, and maybe pro-Ukraine, but they are maybe forming what could potentially be a resistance movement because they're the ones that are being squeezed. It's their men that are dying, their boys that have to be sent off to fight. They are the ones that are suffering the most after this. They're not in that ruling class.
Right.
They're not on the payroll of the West. Right. They're the ones that have to die.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think actually the grim truth, again, Ukraine is a very corrupt society. You can generally buy your way out of anything, out of any other, any obligation that might otherwise be imposed on you. And that's certainly the case with the conscription. We've seen all these videos of these hapless individuals that have been seized by the TCC goons. They're really horrifying. I find them hard to watch. I really feel for those guys. But what we don't see, and it's probably, it's very much a part of these TCC operations, are the people that pay off the goons. And so again, it's like if you have money and you have connections, you can keep out of it. And I think this is something that Ukrainians understand, and it's something they complain about. So it really is the poorer classes that are being sent to the front lines because they can't pay off the goons. So they're seized and they're sent there. Now, do they have a spokesman? None of the people, the big names in politics, really speak for them. But maybe they will at some point. I mean, it's just like there are political entrepreneurs, meaning that there are people in politics who can see an opportunity. You could say this was true about Trump. There's a segment of the population that doesn't have a representative, doesn't have a voice, and someone in politics can recognize that and say, "Here, this is my chance." So maybe somebody within the ruling class will choose to speak for them, out of just pure as a career move, but maybe out of real principle. That's what you hope for. It's just at the present time, and there doesn't seem to be anybody out there. There doesn't seem to be any organized force. There are these spontaneous reactions, and that's something. It shows that there's anger. There's something there, but it's not. Doesn't present a real threat. Not yet. It doesn't present a threat to the ruling elite.
I'm hoping for a Spartacus-like character, some poor boy out there on the front that has a lot of charisma, rises up, takes their country back, kind of thing.
Yeah,
but we'll see. Okay, I want to ask one more question and then move over to the Middle East. Well, this one's just more general. So I was just thinking, we've talked a lot about nuclear war, and I'm worried that Trump is just crazy enough that if anybody would do it, he might be a person that would do it because of his situation and just his personality. Are there any safeguards to prevent this nuclear launch? I mean, it's not like, Congress doesn't vote on something like this. Like, well, are we going to nuke somebody? It's something that's done in secret, so which makes it feel like it's just, there isn't any safeguard. I'm like, is it just a handful of guys that can decide this?
Yeah, well, because, the thing is, it's something that it's understood that this decision may need to be made within a matter of minutes. So, obviously you can't go to Congress or whatever. This is a quick decision that has to be made by the president. Now, more than one person has to be involved. He can't just press a button but those people under him, from my understanding, maybe I'm wrong about this, and and if somebody knows better, please correct me. But that if he issues the order, it's supposed to be carried out. Now, somebody can refuse to. He could be court-martialed later, but he may just say, "This guy is crazy. I'm not doing it. I'm not going to bring about the end of the world." And there's again, there are people below him that have to implement the order, and they may refuse to cooperate. But I don't think there's really any procedure at the top. He doesn't have to go to some, to go before a court, or even if it's a secret court, or you get approval from a committee or anything like that, because it's set up for. It's supposed to be rapid. You're supposed to be able to make this decision quickly and carry it out, execute it quickly. So as a result, to my knowledge, there aren't any significant safeguards.
Well, that's terrifying. It's so terrifying to think that we would consider, even just making nuclear threats, but consider using nuclear weapons when the United States itself is under zero threat whatsoever. The United States itself isn't under threat, but we're here making nuclear threats. What, on behalf of neo-Nazi Ukraine? This is insane. Or on behalf of Israel? I just don't like these two that we could consider using nukes when our own country, nobody's invading us, nobody's bombing us, and we're making threats to use nukes. It's so insane.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, I guess you can't quite say that he made a threat to use nukes, right? It was a response to this tweet, but he said he was going to increase the level of deterrence. He's kind of going to. He didn't use this language, but like put us on a higher alert, something like that.
Yeah, but he did say something like pretty much we're ready for nuclear war, right? Didn't he? Or did I dream
I don't
that?
think he I don't think he used those words. Maybe I'm wrong. I should go back to the tweet, but it was
okay. Maybe I had a dream, but I could have swore I saw a clip on Judge Knapp or something.
I don't think he said. I don't think he said that, but it was. Again, I guess we should go back to the tweet. I don't recall that. It was going to send the subs to appropriate places, and it just sort of like.
Yeah, not the tweet. Something he said on Air Force One. And
okay. Maybe he did. Maybe he did. I haven't actually been keeping up too well on all those things the last 24 hours. And yeah, I
Okay,
wouldn't be surprised if he did say something like that.
right. I mean, just regardless, it's just an insane
Yeah.
thing to think about that when the United States itself isn't at threat, but there's a possibility that the U.S. could use a nuclear war for something that is not existential for us whatsoever.
Yeah.
But that's the situation we're in. Okay, well, let's go to another even crazier part of the world. Let's go to the Middle East. So I just saw this video this morning, and I want to show it to you. Mike
Okay.
Johnson, he called
Right.
recess early because he didn't want to deal with the Epstein stuff and said, oh, I have to take
Okay.
care of things in my district, whatever. And then so instead of dealing with the Epstein thing, this is the first thing that he does.
Mike Johnson, the 56th Speaker of the House of Representatives in America. We're here with a delegation of members of the House. We're so grateful to be in Israel, particularly on this day, recognizing the destruction of the two temples and two times in history. But it is such a moving time for us to be here at the Wailing Wall. We've offered our prayers, we put our notes into the wall as is traditional, and we're so moved by the hospitality of the people and the great love of Israel. Our prayer is that America will always stand with Israel, and that we pray for the preservation and the peace of Jerusalem. That's what Scripture tells us to do. It's a matter of faith for us and a commitment that we have. God bless you.
Everybody in America and I think around the world, a lot of people are saying the United States is owned by Israel. And then if you just make this move, have call recess early so you don't address the Epstein scandal, and then you go over to the Wailing Wall with a bunch of other congressmen and say how much you love Israel. Why would you make such a move like that when everybody's saying,
Well,
hey, that we shouldn't be Israel first, you should be America first?
well, I guess the cynical explanation would be that this is distraction, right? This is a way to get even farther away from Epstein and thinking about the things that we're supposed to think about, which mainly how much we love Israel, how much we support them, et cetera, right? Okay, that's a very cynical view, and that may be part of what's going on. Then you say, well, okay, but isn't this just too obvious? Well, the fact is that these people are owned, you can say, and I think with a great deal of justification, they are owned by Israel. And so, sure, they're babysitters, as Thomas Massey described them, to say, hey, you need to go to Israel. And Israel needs support right now. And indeed, Israel does need support. Israel's starting to feel some heat. And, it's losing the PR war. That has to be apparent to Netanyahu. And so they need good PR. They need to have people like Mike Johnson go to the Wailing Wall and do the usual thing, and just to let everybody know how much the U.S. supports Israel. You can say that, yeah, that's a function of AIPAC and these other, agents or members of the Israel lobby, doing their thing and making sure that, their dutiful servants do what they're supposed to do. Mike Johnson was doing that. The third thing you can say is that he's sincere. He's a Christian Zionist. That's what he was expressing, Christian Zionism, and what's what Christian Zionists do. They go to the Wailing Wall. That's not in traditional Christianity. That's not a holy site. That's part of the Old Testimony, that Old Testament, the Old Covenant. That's no longer regarded sacred by traditional Christians, but to a Christian Zionist, it is sacred. And there he is. Yeah, he said it's a matter of his faith, and I have to assume that he's speaking sincerely when he says that.
Yeah, it's strange because our politicians, they always like to talk about their Christian faith, but it almost feels like they're more Jewish than Christian because you're in Jerusalem. Okay, you're in Jerusalem. You have the holiest site for Christians there as well. You have the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. You have where Jesus was laid to rest and rose again from the dead, right? That's where, but you never see our politicians taking pictures at the Christian sites. Why do our politicians, they're all Christians, but they are all,
Right.
they all have photos of them at the Wailing Wall. A lot of them wearing the little kippah, right? A lot of them there, and just waving the Israeli flag. It's just like, this is, they realize that this is the religion that rejects Christ. That is part of their identity, is that a rejection of Christ. That's what makes them Jewish. And so they're there and praying at a site for people that reject Christ, but they say that they're Christians. And you see all of our politicians that are supposedly Christian that go to this wall, but you never see any pictures of them at the holy Christian sites. You think they would do that just for their own PR? Why not?
Well, it's a good point. Well, in the case of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, that's an Orthodox church, and I think, unfortunately, among many evangelicals, it's not legitimate. They don't regard it as Christian. They don't regard it as a holy site. Now, I think Mike Huckabee is actually kind of an exception, and recently he has protested against attacks on Christians within Gaza and the West Bank. So he does seem to regard, these Orthodox and Catholic Christians as fellow Christians, and he has spoken up for them. Now, he hasn't spoken up for, the suffering Muslim children and other Muslim innocents that have been victims of Israel's barbarism, really. But he has at least extended, the definition of humanity to Orthodox and Catholic Christians. But a lot of evangelicals just don't do it. For them, that's not. But even so, it's a holy land. It's a holy land, you would think, not because Jewish people live there, but because this is the land where Christ walked. And there are Christians who go there, and they do visit the Sea of Galilee and other places, important places that are mentioned in the Bible, in the New Testament. But you're right, politicians seem like, without exception, go to the Wailing Wall. And you would think that as Christians, maybe they would be visiting some of their sites. And, not all Christian politicians are evangelicals. There are Catholics, I think you're right to point this out. I can't recall a single time, that I don't recall any footage. Maybe it's there, but I can't bring an image to mind of an American politician visiting any site other than the Wailing Wall,
right?
Other than Jerusalem. Yeah. So it is a bizarre state of affairs, but that is, that first reflects the relationship between the U.S. and Israel, the political relationship that is there, but it is also a reflection of Christian Zionism, which is a Judaized form of Christianity. I think it's really fair to say. And they regard these things as holy, the Wailing Wall, for example, that traditional Christians don't regard as holy. It's really a very different religion.
Right. When I first saw this video of Mike Johnson there, and I'm seeing all these pictures of other politicians, doing the I Stand With Israel, going to the wall, getting their picture taken, I'm wondering, why would you be doing this when this is bad PR for you? When the accusations that are being leveled at you right now are that you are putting the interest of Israel above the United States. So the smart thing to do for Israel and for these politicians would be to be a little bit quiet about their public support for Israel, but can do it a bit more quietly, underhandedly. That makes sense. And then I was thinking, well, okay, I think the reason that they're being so open about their support of Israel and putting the interest of Israel above America is that the pressure in Israeli society is growing, that there is a fear. They understand that the PR war is going against them. And so the Israeli society needs to be reassured that the United States is owned by Israel. They need to be reassured that the U.S. will do whatever they want to do, that they will come to our aid no matter what. And so the way to do that is to get politicians to come over and say that we're going to stand with Israel no matter what. Go to the Wailing Wall. So they do that, and then they can show to the Israeli society, look, don't worry, we still own America. But the problem is when you do that, you're showing to the American people, hey, look, we own America. And I think that's what's going on here. And they're in a bad spot. And I think it's a bad move. Sure, you might have reassured Israeli society to some extent that, look, we still own the United States. Don't worry. But we're over here in the U.S. like, what the hell is going on? It's so blatant. It's so open. and it's just going to cause, more unrest here in the United States. This issue of unconditional Israeli support is becoming more and more front center. People are wanting to see aid flood into Gaza. They don't want to see our politicians going to Israel and saying, we protect, we defend, respect your right to defend yourself and commit a genocide. That's the last thing people want to hear. But that's what we're getting.
Well, I think, unfortunately, on the Republican side, you still find majorities in favor of Israel. The support for Israel is still there. They, of course, it is diminishing, especially
You're
among
saying
younger people.
The American people? Most
not
Republicans,
the American people, among Republicans, just within
I wonder.
Yeah, well, I know it's diminishing, and before long, it may actually be a minority among Republicans. But the most recent polls show that there's still a majority of approval for Israel among Republican voters. So you could say to some extent that he is in line with his base, and then he's very much in line with his donors. Yeah, there is a problem. I mean, it's just like just because people have become aware of this fact, that now when you go out and do these things, before maybe people didn't put two and two together, but, now they are. So it does contribute to this awareness, this growing awareness of excessive, Zionist influence in the U.S. government. But on the other side, you talk about the Israelis wanting this support, these signs of support. I think in particular is Netanyahu, who is, again, just fighting, is battling to survive, to hold on to his coalition. He's up against a lot. He's under tremendous pressures, within Israeli society. And if, one thing that he can show, one thing that kind of that strengthens his position, and I think you can see again the parallels to Zelensky in Ukraine, is that if he can demonstrate that he still has this unconditional support, that the congressman come, the Speaker of the House, no less, comes into the Wailing Wall and says the usual things. It strengthens his own position. It does help him out in what is really a very precarious situation for him. He's a fight for his survival again.
It's just so crazy that we have politicians that would go to Jerusalem right now on this propaganda tour sponsored by Israel, while Israel's committing this genocide that is causing global backlash against anybody that supports it. It just, like, you go there and you're not far off. There's just people that are starving to death, and you're here saying that I'm praying for the people that are starving the civilian population to death, where we can see it's just getting worse and worse. Hundreds of people being slaughtered daily while they're just lining up to get food. Women and children that are starving to death getting mowed down while they're waiting to get food. It's just so evil. And then you have the audacity to ignore the American people, to not address the Epstein stuff, call recess and say that I'm going to go stay in my district to take care of my people. And you immediately go to Israel and you say that, I pray for Israel and I'm standing here with Israel while all these people are dying. It just shows the level of complicity that the United States has in this genocide. It is such a stain on our history. And, people like this, I wonder if this will be used as evidence of Mike Johnson's complicity in genocide. And I hope we hold these people to account. It's just unacceptable. It's unacceptable that we're doing this. I just can't believe. And they're so open, so brazen. It just pisses me off that I can see this happening. Is our politicians can do this. Yeah, I'm getting worked up.
Well, you should be. Again, there are signs of hope. And one thing I failed to mention, I think, in our last episode was that there was a vote taken in the Senate last week, led by Bernie Sanders, and 27 Democrats actually voted to cut off aid to Israel. And we've never had anything like that before. So that is something. Not a single Republican, it must be pointed out. Not a single Republican. That's Mike Johnson's party. But 27 Democrats, a majority of Democrats actually voted to. Now, it may be less than what it seems. It's just like they want Netanyahu gone. We've talked about that. Like Chuck Schumer, when I actually spoke against Netanyahu quite a while ago, well over a year ago, said that he has to go. Are they really going to go turn against Zionism? Well, I don't know. I don't think that we're quite there yet. But they understand that things are just, the images are so terrible, this current starvation, it does have to end. It's hurting Israel. It's hurting the U.S. And I think that message at least has come through. And that's something, that's the beginning. But within the Republican Party, let's be honest, except for those very brave people like Marjorie Taylor Greene and Massey, that there's still overwhelming support for Israel. And it will go down. I think it's going to go down. It's a permanent mark on this country and this party. It's something that that people won't forget. I think when it's all over, it's a stain that cannot be erased.
Right. No, these are the ultimate traitors to our country. All these people, and yeah, I hope that there's a reckoning. One day that there will be some type of thing. Everybody in our government, they just commit crimes and they just always get away with it. Nobody's held to account. No one's held to account in this country. And it's just, it can't go on like this forever. I mean, everybody's getting so pissed. I mean, it's going to, let's just end it. It's going to
okay.
blow.
All right. We need to. Okay. Very good.
I know you got to get going.
Right. So, I understand. Right.
Yeah. Okay. All right, Dad. All right. You have a good rest of your day and I'll talk to you soon.
Okay.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.